So welcome all of you to our talk today. And as you may know, this is one of the first talks that we are hosting as the Hong Kong Research Hub that we just recently set up at Nanyang Technological University. And thank you, Victor, very much to be one of our first speakers. But this is also a continuation of a seminar series that I organized last May, entitled Hong Kong Uncharted Cultural Production and the Spirit of Publicness. So last May, we host 3 webinars. And after setting up the Hong Kong Research Hub, I have decided that I will keep this as a running series. So yeah, in 3 weeks, we'll have another talk by Winnie Yi from Hong Kong U on the trope of animals in Hong Kong culture. And today we have Dr. Victor Fan from KCL. So just a very brief note of introduction. I think most of the attendants here really actually already know Victor. Victor is reader in film and media philosophy, KCL, and also film consultant of the Chinese Visual Festival. So he already has 2 books, 2 monograph books, Cinema Approaching Reality, Locating Chinese Film Theory by Minnesota, and another book, Extraterritoriality, Locating Hong Kong Cinema and Media by Edinburgh University Press. And I think this is today's talk is part of, sorry, I'm admitting people at the same time. Today's talk is part of his project on the 3rd book, which is titled Cinema Illuminating Reality, Media Philosophy through Buddhism, which will be published in 2002, so this year, by, again, University of Minnesota Press. And so we know that Victor has written extensively on Hong Kong cinema, and also really working very closely with the keyword of reality. It goes through among all the 3 books, right? And today's title, From Extraterritoriality to Extratemporality. So it seems that this is also a project that branches out from your 2nd book on the concept of extraterritoriality. And the 2 objects of interrogation today is digital ecology and independent cinema of Hong Kong. So from here, I will hand over the virtual floor, this space, to Victor. And yeah, I think you can share your screen with us if you like. And we also have quite a long session. So we very much welcome all your questions and comments at the end of the presentation. So Victor, I hand this time to you.
Thank you so much, Chen Chen. And just wanted to say that I feel really, really honored once again to be able to come to the Hong Kong Study Group to present my work, and also to see so many familiar faces, and also faces I haven't encountered, and I hope to be able to keep seeing and keep working with in the future. And so just I'm going to first share my screen first and make sure that we have the materials. Okay. Chen Chen, can you see?
Yes. No problem. Yeah.
Just a quick, super quick clarification. And in Chen Chen's really generous introduction, she mentions about my book project. And so this is actually not part of my 3rd book. So my 3rd book is about Buddhism and film and media philosophy. But this is actually growing out of what I've done in my 2nd book, in combination of some further issues that I have thought about in my 3rd book. So hopefully this could be part of my 4th book. If not, that can be an ongoing project that I can keep playing with. Without further ado, I'm going to start immediately. So basically on the 15th of March, 2021, the Hong Kong Film Critics Society, Golden Scene Cinema, and distributor Ying Yiji announced the cancellation of their evening screenings, which were originally scheduled on the 15th and 21st of March in 2021, of award-winning documentary Li Dawei Inside the Red Brick Wall, and which was made by Hong Kong documentary filmmakers in 2020. Now, the cancellation was triggered by an editorial in the pro-Chinese Communist Party newspaper Wen Weibo on the 11th of March 2021. Now, in this article, the editorial board accuses the film for meihua, or aestheticizing those rioters who had fundamentally violated the article, meaning Article 23 of the Hong Kong National Security Law regarding 煽动 or inciting subversion of state power, unquote. Now, the board called for an immediate cancellation of the screening and argued that the film, by, quote again, openly disseminating anti-police, anti-social, and subversive messages against the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region, HKSAR government, unquote, have effectively committed a criminal offense. Now, my presentation today is not about Inside the Red Brick Wall, nor am I here to comment on the cancellation itself. Rather, this particular incident really served as an inspiration for me to think about the idea that is my initial idea that I proposed back in 2000, to my 2018 book, Extraterritoriality. Do we need some kind of reconfiguration and re-understanding in order to help us rethink, regroup, not only what is going on in Hong Kong independent cinema, but also how these independent filmmakers can move forward to kind of work within an environment that can become increasingly hostile or increasingly unfavorable for independent filmmaking. And so, so the idea is that I find that this highly politicized screening cancellation, as well as the subsequent passing of the new film censorship regulations, have triggered me to ask an interest in asking the relationship between between Hong Kong independent cinema and politics. Now, I am especially interested in the intricate relationship between how cinematic aesthetics has been configured and reconfigured in order to rehearse, cope with, and help the spectators rethink the contemporary mode of sociopolitical and media ecology. Now, as Cameron L. White argues, contemporary Hong Kong independent cinema is best studied not as a number of standalone cinematic works, but as part of a larger circuit of digital media through which both the pro-CCP and pro-democratic participants reclaim and rewrite their respective political positions. For Cameron White, these documentaries must be intertextualized with online videos, including documentations of live or recorded events, montages of found footage, and satires and social commentaries on YouTube channels, mass media, including television, radio, and newspaper, and digital surveillances, including closed-circuit television, cell phones, and other smart devices, and the internet, in order for scholars to fully appreciate the role in the larger media ecology. Now, in other words, my interest is how such a media ecology, seen from both the governmental and civil positions, tell us something more about the relationship between our digital existence and the global post-socialist neoliberal control society. Now, the term digital existence was coined by He Yu. It refers to the fact that digital media are best understood not as tools for human beings to use. Rather, in our day-to-day lived experience, we work with and even configured by digital technology and objects to the extent that our existence is ontologically grounded in the digital. A global, so basically, and the term post-socialism is actually promoted, especially by Jason McGrath, which refers to a global assemblage of economic and geopolitical conditions after 1989, when politicians, economists, cultural producers, and even general public have conceded the Cold War era understanding of socialism as a failure. This essay or this article is, this particular presentation is an extension of my monograph, Extraterritoriality, Locating Hong Kong Cinema and Media. So in this book, I propose the use of the term extraterritoriality, which I will define later on in my talk, as a way to rethink how Hong Kong cinema and media negotiate the city's biopolitical lives. Underlying this concept is Jürgen Habermas' understanding of the public sphere, a democratic network of discourses where contesting private opinions can be negotiated between individuals. But what if a public sphere no longer exists or may have never existed in the first place? Now, in my talk today, I propose a variation of this term, extratemporality. I argue that in a post-socialist control society, the current mode of media ecology or media existence is best understood not as an intertextual negotiation as suggested by White. Rather, it is a techno-social assemblage in which microperceptual, meaning between intuition and perception, and microtemporal, meaning between the extinction and initiation of each point instant, engagements actively rewrite a layout of political relationalities. These microperceptions and microtemporal point instants in turn defines and rewrites the mutually conflicting political positions from one moment to another. Now, in the following time, I will first re-examine the relationalities between media, governmentality, and social movements. Toward the end of this presentation, I will discuss two films, Tan Ji-woon's Blue Island and Clara Law's Drifting Petals. These two films demonstrate and capture how governments and protesters have both made microperceptual and microtemporal decisions and actions in a process of rewriting their relationalities in a political struggle. But at the same time, the cinema, as an older mode of mediation and existence, slows down, stretches out, and makes tangible how these decisions and actions are carried out. It does so by offering an embodied self-reflective experience that perceptualizes the microperceptual and temporalizes the microtemporal. Now, historically, extraterritoriality refers to the right of a biopolitical life to carry the law of the community with them so that they can exercise it or be judged by it outside of the terrain to which the law is bound. The word life here is understood in Foucaultian terms as a pure biological or animal existence that is kept alive, managed, organized, or even killed and executed by the law. Although the concept of extraterritoriality was commonly practiced in ancient and medieval empires, it was repurposed around the 16th century as a way to justify a European sovereign authority's juridical power over its settlers in the mare liberum, or free sea, including the colonies, and adjudicate on disputes between these settlers and the indigenous lives who observed their own law. Now, in the analysis I offer in my book, Extraterritoriality, I point out that the three documents that designated Hong Kong as a British colony, meaning the Treaty of Nanking, the Convention of Peking, and the Convention for the Extension of Hong Kong, were all formulated with legal languages specific to the British and Qing empires' respective understandings of extraterritoriality. As a result, Hong Kong was conceded under Qing's 主权 or sovereign sovereignty, even though the 治权 or administrative right was always consigned to the British Crown during the colonial era. Now, the tension between sovereignty and administrative right was the subject of debate between the British and Chinese governments during the course of the 20th century. After 1997, the concept of the Hong Kong SAR can be considered a mode of juridical extraterritoriality, with the city's administrative right temporarily consigned to qualified participants under Chinese sovereignty. Juridically and politically, and by extension, socioculturally and linguistically, lives who find themselves in an extraterritorial existence are being doubly occupied by mutually conflicting sovereign authorities. Ironically, these authorities exercise their power over these lives by ostracizing them outside their normative juridical political terrain. As these lives are constantly defined in relation to these conflicting authorities and sociopolitical forces, they are always de-individuated, meaning they are unable to establish political individuality. De-subjectivized, meaning they are deprived of political subjectivity, and de-autonomized, meaning they are stripped of political agency. In this sense, these lives are always by default extraterritorial. As a juridical, sociopolitical, and cultural linguistic infrastructure, extraterritoriality underdetermines, as opposed to overdetermines, a formally coherent and self-standing system of sociopolitical discourses and institutions. Now, Giorgio Agamben would even argue that what we regard as the political norm is underdetermined by and configured as a state of exception. Nonetheless, lives who find themselves occupying and being occupied by such a position are not always aware of such an infrastructure and how it codifies their political existence. As an extraterritorial life comes face to face with its state of de-individuation, desubjectivization, and de-autonomization, it finds itself being in a state of sense uncertainty, with a structure of feeling including loss, frustration, anxiety, worry, or even anger. Such feelings produce affective intensities, a desire to take agency over the way political changes are generated and codified. Now, such affective intensities had built up to a point of critical convergence from 1997 to 2014. As Casey Low, Lo Guicheng, and Pao Laiguan argue, the handover of the administrative right over Hong Kong from the United Kingdom to the PRC largely preserved the colonial infrastructure and institutions. This had the effect of maintaining the power of the local business oligarchy and bureaucracy, whose members transferred their loyalty from Whitehall to Beijing. This produced one of the world's most deregulated political economic ecologies, one that largely adhered to the post-socialist, neoliberal, and especially deregulated economies function upon the belief that it is everyday life's responsibility to work hard for both individual and collective prosperity. Even though the means to subsist, let me backtrack a little bit. This produced one of the world's most deregulated political economy and ecologies, one that largely adhered to the Beijing consensus. Now, post-socialist or neoliberal economies function upon the belief that it is everyday life's responsibility to work hard for both individual and collective prosperity, even though the means to subsist of those who have yet to or unable to establish themselves have been actively taken controlled by financial institutions. Thus, a large number of lives in Hong Kong have found themselves precariously employed while the oligarchy continues to celebrate the city's macroeconomic achievements. These economically precarious lives have also found the political voices silenced. The electoral system after 1997 has been configured in a way that the pro-CCP parties would maintain a majority in the Legislative Council, or LECO, while the chief executive or head of government has been nominated and elected by a constituent assembly appointed by Beijing. The pro-democratic camp had also expressed concerns about the compromise of Hong Kong's legislative and judicial autonomy and freedom of speech through direct intervention from Beijing. On the 31st of August 2014, the National People's Congress Standing Committee, NPCSC, of the PRC announced that the CE, meaning the chief executive, was to be elected in 2017 by universal suffrage. Nevertheless, only 2 or 3 candidates were to be chosen by Constituent Assembly. As a consequence, the umbrella movement was initiated. 2 years later, when the Fugitive Offenders and Mutual Legal Assistance in Criminal Matters legislation Amendment Bill 2019 was published on the 29th of March, an even larger scale activist-led socio-political movement was triggered, with some activists calling for the city's independence. The result was a series of police and political crackdowns and the eventual passing of the Hong Kong National Security Law by Beijing's NPCSC on the 30th of June 2020. Now, as Joseph M. Chan and Francis L.F. Lee argue, many local elites who were invited by the Beijing and SAR governments to participate in policy consultation were owners of mass media companies. This encouraged them to fall in line with the Beijing consensus by maintaining neutrality. The only exception, of course, as many of us would know, was Apple Daily, a newspaper owned by Ginny Lai, who was eventually arrested on the 10th of August 2020 and convicted on the 1st of April 2021 under the HKNSL. Hong Kong had served as a hub of foreign correspondents of global media conglomerates, yet the Hong Kong Press Freedom Index for journalists, an index released by the Hong Kong Journalists Association since 2013 for the purpose of monitoring the effect of the increasing presence of governmental control in the SAR, dropped from 40.9 in 2018, which was considered low already, to 32.1 on a scale of 1 to 100. As Chan and Lee, as well as Sylvia Frasina point out, digital media had played an important role in raising civil awareness ever since the handover. They also provided platforms for pro-democracy individuals and organizations when mass media were gradually neutralized. Their empirical studies indicate that from 1997 to 2011, the proliferation of websites, chat rooms, and later social media and smart devices corresponds to a gradual shift of the topic of political discussion in digital and mass media physical rallies and protests, from abstract democratic ideals to concrete local issues. Moreover, Chan and Lee also saw a drastic increase of the number of political processions from 1,013 in 2005 to 10,608 in 2017. They point out that although the number of participants in these processions and events fluctuated, large-scale movements such as the Umbrella Movement in 2014 and the anti-extradition bill protest in 2019 to 20 would have been impossible without digital media. Chan and Lee's studies regard media as a medium that conveys and disseminates information and a public sphere where conflicting opinions are negotiated. This might be a productive way of analyzing the protests against the moral and national education curriculum between 2011 and 2012. The first of the recent large-scale social movements organized by secondary school student group Scholarism and the beginning of the Umbrella Movement. However, during the Umbrella Movement, there was already a split between 2 modes of existence, that is, digital media as a medium that disseminates information. versus a more profound mutual dependency between the physical existence of the protesters and their existence as digital beings and forces of resistance. Now, the umbrella movement took place on a number of geographical sites. Two of them were considered the epicenters of the movement: the Admiralty site, where the seat of this SAR government was located, and the Mongkok site, an area that has been historically run jointly by pro-CCP gangsters and the police. On the one hand, the Admiralty site was centrally organized as a land-bound village under the leadership of scholarism, Occupy Central in Love and Peace, OCLP, and other civic organizations. Here, digital technology was used primarily as an instrument of communication. In fact, photos and news from this protest site were disseminated through social media freely to the outside world as a showcase of its orderliness, peace, and humanity. On the other hand, the Mongkok site was frequently invaded by the police and local triads. This site functioned as an ecology of individual contributions with no centralized leadership. Here, the frequent police invasions necessitated the protesters' constant alertness to microperceptual and microtemporal changes to the environment and physical mobility. Digital networks became crucial not only for the dissemination of information within the community and their friends and allies, but also for making communal decisions in reaction to police interventions. The protesters quickly learned that the information they posted on social media could be intercepted by the pro-CCP supporters and the police. In this sense, life on the Mongkok site could be regarded as a mode of existence that drove and was driven by the trans-individuation between digital information, the networking between digital objects, and the moment-to-moment reconfiguration of the protesters' biological need to survive. Now, by regarding their own existence as digital instead of physical, these protesters effectively turned these digital networks that were appropriated by the government and the police as instruments of surveillance into effective forces of resistance. Now, digital existence is best understood as an anthropotechnical process of becoming that is constantly rewritten by microperceptual and microtemporal shifts in the relationalities between the human body psyche and digital configurations. It does not mean that there is no conceptual difference between corporeal body, psyche, and the digital counterparts, but their mutual dependency and boundaries are microperceptually and microperceptually shifting in a molar manner. Shane Danson argues that images that determine and are driven by these configurations are often communicated and discussed between machines. This is because text, pictures, and sounds, once being transduced and translated into digital data, are processed through an algorithm that can reduce the file size. This algorithm is used not only to maximize transmission speed, but also predict possible outcomes. For example, in a live video chat, which is what we're doing now, a user's facial expression is captured and then processed through an algorithm so that several possible expressions in the next temporal instant can be predicted. The digital processor will then only rewrite a slight change of the user's lips or eyes while keeping the rest of the picture unanimated. When the user makes a physical move in the next instant, the algorithm can then confirm the actualized facial expression. These possible images, however, are impossible to be seen by the human eyes, even though they exist digitally. This is not to say that digital technology causes a change in human existence. Rather, the human and the digital are trans-individuated in the same manner that human and techniques have always been. Yet it does mean that digital technology potentially enables outcomes that are to be confirmed by human actions, thus calling into question where agency lies in this process. Now, as I argue in my forthcoming book, Cinema Illuminating Reality, if we follow the Buddhist principles of dependent originations, there is no such thing as fundamental existence or existential value. Rather, the existence of one being or object depends on the existence of an assemblage of other beings and objects that constitute an ecology of interdependent relationships. Thus, there is no ultimate agency. There are but only a circulation of desire, anger, and frustration and delusion, with drive and are in turn driven by the emergence and extinction of technical digital networks and beings. It does mean that what we call agency is an aggregate of desire, anger, and frustration and delusion. But it doesn't mean that we don't pay attention to agency. It means that we need to be mindful of our agency and exactly how agency is constantly rewritten from one moment to another, microperceptually and microtemporally. For Brian Masumi and Aaron Manning, digital existence brings to the fore an interval or non-interval between feeling and thinking, a microperceptual and microtemporal instant or non-instant at which an impulse to affect and be affected by other configurative bodies, psyches, elements, and energies is enacted. 4th to 5th century Buddhist philosopher Vasubandhu calls this a manasikara, or karmic impulse, potentialities that are based on technical and biological memories, which are actualized into forms that constitute our consciousness. For Vasubandhu, these impulses run on autopilot unless we become mindful of their microperceptual and microtemporal operations. In other words, in order to know what agency really is, we need to be mindful of these impulses. Now, Masumi observes that state authorities in the United States since the September 11 attacks have been configuring our digital existence in a way that our fear of threat would be harnessed to allow these impulses to run on autopilot, a form of power that he calls onto power. In other words, digital technology of surveillance affects and is affected by the digital network's potential usurping of those microperceptual impulses that are crucial in the formation of agency. From 2014 to 2019, Euro-American and Japanese media reported that the Hong Kong SAR government began to employ the PRC's national surveillance system, often called or misnamed the Great Firewall, and tracing technology through broadband cellular networks. These measures have become more about board ever since the legislation of the HKNSL and, of course, with the pandemic. A key difference between the umbrella movement and the anti-extradition bill protest was the latter participants' awareness of their digital existence. The 2019 to 2020 protests had no centralized leadership. Instead, local activists disseminated information about scheduled or spontaneous gatherings, informed their cohorts about police locations and activities, warned each other against police surveillance of the digital devices, made decisions about strategies and arranged escape routes and transportation. Such guerrilla warfare was built upon the network of mutually unknown activists who might have never met each other physically or corporeally, yet their interconnectivity, mutual loyalty, and sense of community were founded on their digital existence as signals, images, voices, and texts. The longevity of their struggle was partly attributable to their ability to turn a digital ecology that had been configured for the purpose of governmentality into a milieu where microperceptual and microtemporal opportunities could allow them to regain transient, though potentially impactful agency. Now, as Bernard Stiegler argues, from the perspective of governmentality, digital existence facilitates and is facilitated by an active territorialization of the supposedly transnational cyberspace. It seeks to de-anonymize, identify, monitor, and archive biometric data instead of life and its activities. Cybernetics therefore traces these biometric data the activities and the relationalities. It also predicts and preempts microperceptual and microtemporal outcomes, which await the corresponding biopolitical lives to confirm in action. A biopolitical life is therefore doubly occupied by a past that has been cybernetically archived and analyzed, and a number of possible futures that only the digital devices, and of course the government, can see. In this sense, extraterritoriality is best reconsidered in additionally as extratemporality, that a biopolitical life is always extratemporal to the technical flux prescribed by the governmental apparatus, an instant or non-instant at which they can either fulfill one of the prescribed outcomes or take agency to rewrite an unpredicted or unpredictable outcome. Now, if extraterritoriality still operates within the framework of biopolitics, extratemporality is neither biological nor political. A set of extratemporal data extracted from a biopolitical life is stripped from political agency via onto power, and it is also decorporealized as its body doesn't matter. For Judith Butler, lives that have been rendered sociopolitically and economically precarious have nothing other than their bodies as media. For them, meaning for Butler, by making visible their sensible bodies on the street, they gave the city and the polis a new geopolitical contour, allowing both the participants and the witnesses a chance to perceive themselves and the place they occupy in the materiality and textual complexity. During the 2019 to 2020 protests and their aftermath, the importance of corporealizing and depoliticizing a depoliticized set of data, meaning biopolitical life, or formerly biopolitical life, took the form of what Walter Benjamin would call constitutive violence, meaning violence for the purpose of deterring violence or constituting a new juridical order, including suicides, invasion of the electrical building for the purpose of reclaiming it from the oligarchy, physical fights against political brutality, and eventually submission to arrest and imprisonment. Now, within the context of this overall media ecology, independent fiction films and documentaries, being an older cinematic form, and again, older in quotation marks, are the least immediate mode of intervention. Unlike other digital community technology, or DCT, and a physical body, a film involves a temporal delay. It requires a temporalization of the microtemporal and perceptualization of the microperceptual. In other words, these two most important aspects of digital existence, together with their affective intensities, are transduced through the film's mise-en-scène into a recollection image, whose process of becoming has been slowed down, reevaluated, and narrativized, or even embodied in cinema as a pure optical and sound situation, a pure passage of time. This has the effect of making sensible the extratemporal position as a durée or duration, understood as a temporality that is experienced and instantiated as a consciousness. Now, I choose to discuss Drifting Petals and Blue Island because both films are about how traces of history not only left their indelible marks on the psyche and subjectivity of contemporary Hong Kongers, but are also actively contributing to the rewriting of their conception of temporalities. They both do so by relating the anti-extradition law movement to the memories and experiences of those who were involved in previous socio-political movements. Now, in Drifting Petals, the memories of the 2019 to 2020 protests are interwoven with those who died and survived Macau's Mortem 123 in 1966 and the nation-building revolutionaries in the 1890s. In Blue Island, director Chan Ji-woon serves as an enabler for an expatriate from the mainland to swim to Hong Kong in the 1970s in Escape of the Cultural Revolution, a 1967 leftist who was imprisoned by the colonial government, a student activist from Hong Kong who witnessed the 1989 Tiananmen crackdown, and a contemporary protester who awaits his trial under national security law. The point de départ, or starting point, and the ways in which the different historical memories are interwoven, however, are very different between these two films. Director Clara Law began her career in 1970. Like many New Wave filmmakers, Law made mainstream commercial films in the 1980s and 1990s, and later emigrated to Australia. Drifting Petals therefore navigates through memories of the past via the voice of Clara Law herself, who openly confesses that she missed the umbrella movement and the 2019-2020 protests because she was abroad. And the drifting body of a young pianist, Jeff, who plays himself, who returns to Hong Kong in 2020 from Manchester in order to seek employment. Clara Law's voiceover slowly and gradually reveals to us that her brother left home one evening in 1966 in Macau, presumably to join the anti-colonial protests there. He then never returned home, presumably being one of the protesters who were brutally shot by the police. Law's voice is often accompanied by images of the deserted streets of Macau as the smooth handheld camera on gimbal desperately tries to follow the drifting ghost of a young man, the young man whom you are seeing here in the image, who by the end of the film reveals himself to be her brother's best friend. Meanwhile, Jeff runs into a young woman, Man, who one night in post-protest Admiralty. Man desperately looks for her boyfriend, whom she claims must be in Tama, protesting, and is in great danger, being sought by the police. Jeff locates her boyfriend, Simon, who constantly dismisses Man's worries. Yet Jeff and the spectators gradually realize that the boyfriend might have been dead from jumping off a bridge in Admiralty, whereas Man might have been stabbed to death by her own father. The two ghostly encounters overlap with the shared collective memory of the anti-Qing revolutionaries who sacrificed their lives in Hong Kong and Macau in the hope of building a democratic Chinese nation. Now, what implies this double journey between Clara Law's search for her brother and Jeff's wandering in the city is therefore a combination of the central shock of the political trauma of 2014 as well as 2019 and 20, as well as their absence from these events. Yet their absence from the precisely microtemporal and microperceptual digital existence that constitutes the lived experiences of the participants in their perpetual need to drift in an alienating city is displaced to and replaced by the hypertemporalized flanneurship of Jeff, and a similarly wandering and disembodied voice of Clara Law herself. Therefore, embedded in the narrative is a tension between the lives of the ghosts, who often dash from one place to another under extreme anxieties, distrust, and a sense of loss, danger, and failure, and the equally lost, alienated, yet drawn-out temporality of Jeff and Clara Law. The ghost's sense of fragmentation is embodied by often less stabilized handheld camera, fast-paced editing, and a constantly shifting of focus between an image's foreground and background. Meanwhile, the dolorous drifting of Jeff and Clara are conveyed by long takes and continuous takes on gimbal, or in the soundtrack, the use of literary instead of verbal language, instead of vernacular language. It is important to point out that the camera often frames the characters against the cityscape of Hong Kong or Macau, or in this particular image, against the desert of Australia. Thus, the overall city in the very present serves as an environmental, socio-political, and ethical infrastructure where the ghosts from the past, as well as their memories, ambitions, desires, anxieties, and worries, coexist with those of the living on the plane of immanence. As Gilles Deleuze argues, the present and the past on this equalizing plane is no longer discernible. Rather, in each optical and sound situation, the image as a consciousness is the present of the past, the present of the present. Or as Jacques Derrida would argue, the film as an image serves as a palimpsest, which is compiled of memories and images that the political authority seeks to erase. Yet the traces of the erasure haunt the very ontological ground of the living's own existence. Yet Deleuze and Derrida's reading, while being applied on this film, forecloses any potentiality for the future, as the idea of haunting carries Bergson's idea that the present is an accumulation of all the memories from the past, which overdetermines the future. Thus, such a view of the future becomes fatalistically haunted by the failure, trauma, and the pain from the past. But as Buddhist philosopher Thich Nhat Hanh would argue, based on the scholarship of Dignaga and Vasubandhu, we are never haunted by someone or something. Rather, we are haunted by both individualized and collectivized desires, anger and frustration, as well as delusion, worries, and anxieties. Meanwhile, the modes of our existence and the process of our interbeing and interbecoming are best understood as manifestations of these desires, frustration, delusion, worries, and anxieties. In other words, we are not haunted by the past. Instead, we let these affective intensities haunt us and inform our modes of becoming. Now, this is not a negative thing. This is actually can be a constructive thing. Therefore, the film image as a plane of immanence enables our consciousness to get an insight into these affective intensities, thus making it possible for us to be mindful of them while experiencing them, and to potentially reconfigure them as a way to take real agency over the future. Now, the same can be said about Blue Island, which first tells the story of a man who fled China in the 1970s in order to seek refuge in colonial Hong Kong. This first sequence intertwines interviews of the old man and his wife, reenactments of their escape by their own grandchildren, and footage of the old couple partaking of the recent Hong Kong protests. This sequence is followed by the story of a 1967 leftist protester who firmly believes in the anti-colonial movement of his time and has been showcased by the Hong Kong media as a patriot. Yet in his interviews and the film's reenactments of his imprisonment in the 1960s, the spectators gradually learn that he has always felt betrayed by the PRC, who has abandoned them during the movement and has never acknowledged the 1967 riots' role in China's anti-colonial history. This is followed by a sequence about a student leader who visited Beijing in 1989 and witnessed the Tiananmen crackdown. Even though he expresses his support for the protesters today, he feels betrayed by their abandonment of the 1989 cause. This seemingly linear episodic structure is often punctuated by the inclusion of the film crew in the frame and a constant cutting back and forth between the interviews, footage of these characters in the present, and the reenactments of their past. And after these four sequences, the film begins to allow one trajectory to cross path with the other, to the extent that the boundaries between these stories and experiences become increasingly indiscernible. The increasing indiscernibility enables the image consciousness to gain an insight into their interrelationalities. In the middle of the film, the 1967 veteran and a contemporary anti-extradition law protester are asked by the director to sit in a cell in Stanley Prison in the evening. In this early 20th century facility, by now historical listed site, which is dimly lit as though the only light would come from the moon outside, one can hear the gentle surfs from the beach nearby. In an almost meditative state, the 1967er, who disapproves of the contemporary political movement, speaks candidly about the shared affects of their abandonment, betrayal, and alienation with his younger cellmate. Like drifting petals, the film image here puts the past and the present on a plane of immanence. Yet the result is not the simplistic attainment of mutual understanding or superficial comparison between the two historical moments. Rather, the image consciousness makes tangible the affective intensities shared by both characters and are in fact circulating in the overall anthropo-technical ecology that constitutes Hong Kong as a structure, identity, and site of desubjectivization and potential resubjectivization. It is interesting to conclude, it's interesting that both works of cinema temporalizes the microtemporal and perceptualizes the microperceptual. In other words, by stretching, prolonging, and making tangible layers of temporality over the course of the image consciousness process of becoming, as well as the interbecoming of the characters that constitute part of the image, the film enables spectators, directors, and even the characters a second chance to relive, rethink, and re-understand their own experiences. Yet what these two films achieve is neither a hauntology nor a palimpsest of nostalgia and pure reflection. Rather, it makes tangible the here and now of the image as the present and as an embodied experience. The present is, of course, an instantiation of memories from the past, but precisely because of this, we often look back to the past and worry about the present and worry about the future. And it is a combination of our reminiscence and anticipation that compel us to act, react, and our inability to reflect. What we miss, however, is to experience the present as the present. It is through a full mindfulness of the present as the present that we can begin to understand all those longings, anger and frustration, worries and anxieties that drive us and are driven by us. The solution is not to abandon these longings, anger and frustration, but to live it. And while living it, to become mindful of them so that we can understand where lies the agency to rewrite them, to make them productive, and be able to generate a positive future. Thank you so much.